Right. So going back to getting started, your first thing is obviously you're going to decide what genre it is, what tone you're going to take, whether it's going to be lighthearted, whether it's going to be heavy. You know, the feel of The Witcher is very different from the feel of Bridgerton, and the type of story you want to tell. So you're going to decide now whether you want series, serial, and how you're going to link these characters. So even if you decide to write a standalone, this might just sort of be forced on you as you go. So, for example, if you have written a book where your characters are at college, you might then land up keeping the college or a group of friends at college. So, for example, the TV show Friends is unified by the coffee shop where they all hang out and this group of friends. Now, you could imagine turning them into a series of books. Each of those 6 characters could get their own book. You know, that would be one way of handling it. So you would need to decide how you're going to connect these characters. Then, before you get started, if you go in on book 1 already deciding that you want to make this a series of linked books, you need to already think about your world building. Friends, for example, is set in New York City in, what was it, the 90s. Gilmore Girls is set in a certain town. Virgin River is set in a particular place. So you're going to decide what is going to connect these characters. Hogwarts, I mean, that's really the most beautiful example, because even though that world grows with each book, by the time the first book was written and published, I think J.K. Rowling already had to have a pretty comprehensive view of what this world was like. And a lot of it probably never made it into book 1. Then you need to think about your characters and your character arcs. And I am going to go into this in more detail later in this presentation. But who are your characters? Are they going to run all the way through the series? Are you going to just do different people in each episode? Like, for example, in Marvel, you've got different people, a different set of characters in Black Panther to Thor to Avengers. It changes with each sort of Marvel is a whole universe on its own. We'll talk more about that later as well. And then you need to also decide whether you're going to have individual character arcs within each story or an overarching one, like the battle against President Snow in the Hunger Games. Then my recommendation is start with the simplest story as your entry point and then build on that. So, for example, if you were Anne McCaffrey writing her spaceship sort of human hybrid books, you're going to pick out of all of these characters that you might have in your head, you're going to pick the one that's the simplest story to tell, especially if you're a beginner writer. You don't want to be biting off more than you can chew. You'll notice, for example, that the very first Harry Potter book is actually really simple. It's it doesn't yet have all the overarching stuff. It's got the potential to have all that overarching story that follows in the later books, but it really is the most simple story that can be told. You don't start with the Deathly Hallows. You start with Harry Potter arriving at school, discovering that there is evil in this world. He doesn't go up against Voldemort immediately. He goes up against a teacher. And of course, the mystery comes in which teacher is really the bad guy. So, world building. Again, I suggest start small with room to expand. If you've got to take 3 chapters just to explain the rules of how your world works, readers will be out. They don't have the patience. They read for story. So start small in the most simple way. Arrive at Hogwarts. You don't have to explain what happened in the wizarding world over the last 50 years. You just have to start with Harry arriving at school, and little bit, we learn about his world. The same thing goes for Star Wars. We open up on Tatooine planet. We realize that there are these evil stormtroopers. We don't need to know everything that happened in the previous, in the trilogy that became the prequel trilogy, which was filmed later, which is probably a big reason why George Lucas started on episode 4 and not episode 1, because episode 1 actually requires a lot of explanation. It was a very complicated world, and which is possibly why the prequels never did quite as well. If you start small, Tatooine, world at war, oppressive regime, and a small group of rebels fighting against the bad guys. Start small. We can instantly get into the story. We instantly understand it. We don't need to have lots of world building to explain it. And then you can build on it in subsequent stories.
Romy,
So
before you go on to your next point, can I jump in with a blatant plug? On your Now Novel dashboard, you will find the world building section. It allows you to look at numerous different levels of world building. It goes into painstaking detail on the actual world and customs and processes and how things work, down to cities and neighborhoods and areas like that. There's a lot of detail in there, so it works particularly well for sci-fi, fantasy, where things are very different and setting is a big area. But even for anywhere else, it can be useful if setting is such a big focus of what you're doing.
That's actually a very good point. Yes, because you should ideally plan out your world beforehand. Even though you're starting small on the pages of the book that the reader is going to see, you need to know what exists outside of that world. If you don't know, for example, that in the wizarding world, there are other schools in other parts of the world, then you know, when you get to, maybe that's a bad example, but for example, if you've got the bigger picture, if you know that the world can expand in later stories, it means you can already lay clues. So, you know, a function like the world building dashboard is really great because it means you can put everything out there and then look within that to what clues can you give quickly to the reader without wasting time. What are the quickest shorthand notes that can tell the reader how this world works? So, for example, the Hunger Games. You don't start out, there is a bit of an introduction to what happened in the past and why the Hunger Games exist, but we start small. We start with, we realize that this is an oppressive regime. We realize what the Hunger Games, we learn what the Hunger Games are. The fact that there's another entire district that has been literally underground, that we don't get revealed until later, even though the author quite possibly knew that before she even started writing book one. So use the dashboard to plot out your whole world and then to highlight which clues you can give in book one. And then look at beyond that, how you can expand this world. So for example, in the Hunger Games, you can expand it by now adding in more history and detail about the background and why the world works, this world works the way it does. My kids got very into the Hunger Games last year during the pandemic and can tell you absolutely every aspect of the history of the world of Panem. And that is because they went on to read the later books where all of that is given, but it's not all given in book one. And then be very careful of painting yourself into corners. So, for example, this is why I recommend build your whole world as much as possible beforehand. So, for example, if J.K. Rowling, she has, in book one, she already introduces Gringotts Bank. So that means for the following books, Gringotts Bank is going to be the way it is. She can't now rewrite it or change things. And of course, this is what's happened with Darth Vader. If you start off with Darth Vader already on the dark side, your prequels are preordained. You kind of know where he's going to end up. You've got no room to flex and move. We already know that he is going to have a negative arc and land up on the dark side.